If we were to imagine a worst case scenario in which Israel would be forced to nuke Iran, what would that scenario be?
What a great question, David.
The conflict between Israel and Iran is intensifying, and if it escalates into a broader regional war, this could have disastrous consequences on the rest of the global economy.
We are looking at pictures of Tel Aviv, what you're describing.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, God. Okay, guys, we got to get off the roof.
Let's recap some recent developments from the Middle East. On October 10th, Israeli airstrikes continued on Beirut, Lebanon, killing 22 people. The Israeli Defense Forces say that their fight in Lebanon is against Hezbollah, and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu issued the following statements to the Lebanese people.
Israel withdrew from Lebanon 25 years ago, but the country that actually conquered Lebanon is not Israel, it's Iran. Iran, which finances and arms Hezbollah to serve Iran's interests at Lebanon's expense. Hezbollah has turned Lebanon into a stockpile of ammunition and weapons and a forward Iranian military base. Just one day after the October 7th massacre a year ago, Hezbollah joined the war against Israel. It launched an unprovoked attack on our cities and on our citizens. It has since fired over 8,000 missiles at Israel, killing civilians without distinctions.
Israel has already killed multiple Hezbollah leaders and operatives over the past month, including its leader Hassan Nasrallah. In response to Israel's attacks on Lebanon on October 4th, Iran launched nearly 200 ballistic missiles to strike Israel, many penetrating the Iron Dome defense system. Israel has since vowed to retaliate against Iran. Now, it has several options to do this. Attacking Iran's nuclear facilities is one such option, but Iran has indicated that if this happens, they would change their nuclear doctrine and escalate potentially the development of a nuclear bomb. Oil markets have responded to these escalations recently by rallying, with Brent crude and WTI both going to above $75 a barrel. Striking Iran's oil facilities is another one of Israel's retaliatory options, but Iran has threatened to then strike Arab countries friendly to Israel, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, oil-rich countries, and if their oil facilities are damaged, this could have huge impact on the world oil markets. Furthermore, if Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation to an Israeli attack, this could block 21 million barrels of oil from flowing to world markets. Now, both of these outcomes could send oil prices skyrocketing and potentially devastate global economies. So it's very crucial that we understand what exactly is happening in the Middle East and what could happen next, because depending on how Israel will retaliate against Iran, which, by the way, is a consensus expectation that they will, how they could do it could leave ripple effects on the rest of the world. Joining us to discuss this issue and the U.S. presidential election is Marko Papic, Chief Strategist of GeoMacro Strategy at BCA Research and the former partner and chief strategist at Clock Tower. He was also a former senior analyst at Stratfor and the author of Geopolitical Alpha. Good to have you back again, Marko. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you too, David. How's it going?
All eyes are on what Israel is about to do next. Now, it's been almost 2 weeks since the missile attack from Iran, and Israel hasn't retaliated yet. Why not?
Well, clearly because they are negotiating with the United States, which is an important, this has been covered in the news, so I'm not really adding any value to anybody watching this. It's just obvious. And so what I would say about that is that it does tell us an important fact, which is that Israel does have constraints, and those constraints are ultimately that the United States of America is not just going to let Israel do whatever it wants. The other issue is that there could be a temporal factor to their delay. And what I mean by that is that let's assume for a second that Israel has decided to do something pretty dramatic, strike exporting terminals that Iran has. So not domestic refineries for domestic consumption, but actually the kind of facilities that would matter to global investors, Iranian oil exporting facilities or nuclear sites. Let's say that they have decided that they must do that, but that they're just going to give the United States of America, the luxury of waiting. In other words, they're going to strike these facilities after the election day. And so we would actually have to wait another 3 weeks for that kind of a response, because Israel does not want to influence U.S. politics. That would be a very, very dangerous move by Israel, because if oil prices go to $120, but Kamala Harris wins, they will be shopping for Sukhoi airplanes in 2025, not American ones. So that's a very, very critical danger for Israel. So the delay could be because something much bigger is being planned after the US election, or it could be simply a delay to calibrate the response over the next couple of days. And in fact, the response is imminent. It could happen this weekend, could happen next week. But if it does happen before the election, it's almost certain that it will have to have that, housekeeping seal of approval from the U.S. government.
Why are the stakes much higher with Iran than with Hezbollah and or Hamas?
Well, obviously, the big difference is that Hezbollah and Hamas are terrorist organizations. Let's just be very clear on that. Iran is a sovereign nation. Hezbollah and Hamas don't have surface-to-air missiles. Hezbollah and Hamas do not have strategic or tactical fighter capability. Hezbollah and Hamas do not have the ability to upset global oil supply. Iran does. And it's not just about Iranian direct retaliation against the UAE or Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned in the introduction, but it's also about Iranian control over Iraq, which is an extremely underestimated aspect of this entire situation. Iran effectively runs Iraq through its various Shia militant proxies. And Iraq does send about 4 to 5 million barrels of oil a day. The Basra terminal is extremely important. There's basically 2 pipelines there that feed ships that hook into Basra. And there's all sorts of scenarios where a retaliation against Iran that goes over the edge actually produces not just 1.5 million barrels lost, which most analysts say, well, OPEC can overcome that. It could actually be 1.5 to 4 million if Iranian retaliation also involves Iraqi production.
This begs the question as to whether or not Israel needs the U.S. to give permission. Now, there's varying viewpoints on this from the government. So take a look at how Biden answers this question versus, and then I'll play a Trump clip as well.
Support an attack on Iran's nuclear sites by Israel?
The answer is no. We'll be discussing with the Israelis what they're going to do, but all 7 of us agree that they have a right to respond, but they should respond in proportion.
Take a listen to what Trump said when he was asked about this issue.
Biden says that Israel should not target Iranian nuke facilities. What are your thoughts on that? What should Israel respond?
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. It's the biggest risk we have. The biggest risk we have is nuclear. To make the statement, please leave their nuclear alone, I would tell you that that's not the right answer. That was the craziest answer. Because you know what? Soon they're going to have nuclear weapons, and then you're going to have problems.
All right, who's right?
It's a very difficult answer. It's a great setup. I like this. Who is right? I think Trump is right. But notice that he doesn't say that Israel should attack Iranian nuclear sites. He doesn't actually say that. He says that Biden's non-equivocal, very clear answer no is a crazy answer. And I agree with that. Why? Because the threat of attacking Iran's nuclear facilities is a very important piece of leverage that the United States has, not Israel. Israel does not have the capability to attack them. It has tactical bombers, not strategic. It doesn't have the bunker buster technology. It has bunker buster technology that can kill the leader of Hezbollah in a Lebanese suburb. It does not have bunker buster technology that will go 40 meters underground and destroy the Fordo facility where Iran enriches most of its uranium. And there's a reason for this. The United States of America does not want Israel to have agency when it comes to determining something as significant as attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. So the reason that Trump is right in his answer is that the United States of America as a global power should retain the threat and the leverage of basically, forcing Iran to think twice about whether or not its nuclear facilities are safe, not from Israel, but safe from the United States of America, which can destroy them if it wanted to.
Are you liking the video so far? Well, before we continue, let me tell you about an innovative way to create videos, which I can tell you from personal experience can be challenging and time-consuming. Today's sponsor, InVideo AI, makes the process incredibly simple. Whether you are a content creator, marketer, or business owner, InVideo AI transforms your ideas into polished, professional quality videos in just minutes. It's the world's most used AI video creator with over 10 million users across 150 plus countries. All you need to do is type out a text prompt. From there, you can get creative and fine-tuned ideas for your videos using just text commands. It's like having your own video editor on standby. And the best part, you can clone your voice and make it narrate the videos in your own voice in any language. It does the job of more than 10 tools packed into one and costs just $20 a month to start with. Scan the QR code on the screen here or use my code link down below to get 2 times the video generation credits in your first month. Yeah, and Israel has threatened to focus its enriched uranium processing on nuclear weapons if they were to attack their nuclear facilities. Now, like you just pointed out, I mean, is this even possible? If the West destroys their nuclear facilities, how are they going to enrich the uranium to create nuclear weapons?
Well, unfortunately, David, over the last 4 years, under the Biden administration, Iran has actually enriched sufficient quantities of uranium to produce a weapon. So,
Okay.
Now, obviously, we can blame Biden for not being threatening enough and not being forceful enough. You can blame Trump as well for basically rolling back the JCPOA. So, it's, both of them are, I guess, to blame. But the reality is that if the United States of America were to bomb Iran, it would do so strategically. It has the strategic bombers that fly above 30,000 feet, that drop very serious ordnance. They would flatten Iran's industrial capacity, and Iran has no ability to defend against this, none. It would be basically like conquistadors versus the Incas. Whereas if it was Israel, then Israel does not have that capability. And I find it very somewhat interesting that a lot of armchair geopolitical strategists out there are equating Israel's success against Hamas and Hezbollah, which are terrorist groups, and extrapolating it linearly into this some sort of idea that Israel has preponderance of power to strike a country thousands of miles away with limited refueling capacity, with no strategic bombing capacity. Again, remember, it's fighter jets carrying large ordnance. That's not the way to destroy somebody's industrial capacity. So to answer the question is, again, the United States of America has the ability to threaten Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel does not. That's one of the reasons that I think that Israel will not attack nuclear facilities. I think the other reason is that there is an election. So if they do, again, going back to the temporal factor here, if Israel decides to strike before the U.S. election over the next couple of weeks, I suspect they will focus on military sites, maybe domestic refining, which is basically refining to turn oil into petroleum products for domestic consumption, not export. That I can see happening. But if they, however, wait for after the November election, then I think investors have to think broadly. If the Israeli retaliation is delayed further, for example, then, we could be in a world where the Biden administration basically just decides to end this once and for all and just say, we got this. We will take care of it. And the United States actually makes an ultimatum to Iran, which is that you either roll back your nuclear program or we will strike it before the Trump administration comes in this, transition period, or Harris administration if they win.
The other theory I've heard is that Israel is negotiating with the U.S. in the hopes of pulling the U.S. military into actual direct involvement. Is there any truth to this theory?
Well, yes, as I just articulated, David, if this is something that takes after the U.S. election, then I think that there is logic in the U.S. just saying, look, we'll just take care of it. You don't have the military capability. Look, Israel does have the capability of striking facilities. It doesn't have the capability of having 100% or 90% probability of them being, impaired.
Yes.
So the U.S. might just say, we'll just take care of it after the election. Don't cause an oil shock before the election that will impact U.S. domestic politics. You're not allowed to do that, but we will take care of Iran. And ultimately, one thing I just want to tell everyone watching this, if there had been no Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th, if there had been no attack, honestly, David, we would be right here talking about this issue, because the chart of Iran's nuclear enrichment is pretty clear. We are more than double the level that almost caused U.S. to bomb Iran in 2011. Iran has almost doubled the stockpile that it had in 2011 when the Biden administration was contemplating striking Iran. So even if there was no Israel-Hamas, Israel-Hezbollah conflict right now, we would be having this same conversation, which is, look, the negotiations failed. Biden administration was not able to revive JCPOA. Iran has continued to build up stockpiles. After the election, there's going to be one of those put up or shut up moments where Iran and US either find a conclusion or there is a kinetic action to roll back their nuclear program.
Let's discuss the other scenario, which you said may be less likely, which is a strike on oil facilities. Iran has threatened to attack other Arab nations more friendly to the West and Israel should this happen and attack their oil facilities. How credible is this threat actually?
I think it is. It's a credible threat, which is why I'm pretty sure that it's not going to happen. In other words, again, before the U.S. election, if Israel were to attack Iranian export facilities, I think that would be a bridge too far, if you will, from a U.S. perspective. And so it's pretty clear that the U.S. administration is telling Israel there's absolutely no need to impact Iranian export facilities. Now, the dynamic here that has been pretty clear is that Iran and Saudi Arabia detente, which I've been stressing to my clients as the most important factor in Middle East politics, is real. It's a real detente and it's working. For the past 12 months, Iranian proxies like Houthis have struck almost all the shipping going through the Red Sea. Not a single drone went north, not a single one. Didn't impact the Saudi facilities as Houthis have successfully attacked in 2019, or UAE facilities as they have done in 2022. And it's very interesting to me how nobody out there is really focusing on this issue. No analyst has tried to explain why the Houthis have been so restrained. And the answer, obviously, is because Iran and Saudi Arabia have a deal. That deal has worked, and it has basically prevented, Iran from retaliating to global oil shipping. And this is not something that United States will want to do over, if you will. They're not going to be comfortable with Israel provoking Iranian attack against Saudi Arabia. Part of the reason is, of course, the election. But the other reason is that Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar are important allies of the United States. And if the United States is proven to be incapable to control their ally Israel, then the United States will see further drift of critical strategic allies, much more critical, much more strategic than Israel, by the way. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE host American bases. They produce a lot of energy for the global marketplace. The United States does not want to see them drift to China or other powers. And so it's almost, I would argue that the United States has almost more of an incentive to prevent Israel from attacking Iran's oil facilities than nuclear sites.
Well, the oil markets would like to know whether or not the Strait of Hormuz would be closed or blocked by the Iranian Navy, because that would have huge ramifications for the oil price, presumably sending it skyrocketing. In what scenario would that happen, Marko?
Well, look, I think Iran would attempt to do it. I think it's pretty clear that they've had a plan to do it by swarming small craft that are difficult to handle, and also use sea mines that would be deployed. Of course, they did that in the late 1980s. They ventured down this path once, and it led to the famous Operation Praying Mantis. I encourage all of your viewers to Google it and read the Wikipedia page on Operation Praying Mantis. The United States of America basically sunk the entire Iranian Navy in the course of 36 hours. So it is a very, very dangerous move by Iran. The preponderance of power between Iran and the United States, I compared it earlier in the show to basically conquistadores showing up in South America. I mean, it is that vast, the technological gulf between the two. Iran has no way to prevent the United States Navy and the United States Air Force from basically dominating their airspace and sinking all their ships. So what I would say, David, is that it's highly unlikely that they would actually go down that route, because if they did, it would give the United States the legitimate excuse to proceed to degrade not just their military, but also their industrial capacity. I mean, we're talking complete and utter destruction of Iran's, industrial capabilities.
Yes, you're right. There is a huge difference. I mean, the conquistadors and the natives. That's the difference, like you outlined. However, Iran has an ally in the form of Russia. Now, just today, we're speaking on Friday, the 11th of October. I think you know where I'm going with this. Putin is meeting with the Iranian president in Central Asia. They're talking about economic ties. What could Putin do, or what would the likely Russian response be if, let's say, hypothetically, Iran were to block the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. Navy sinks their Navy in 36 hours. What does Putin do?
Well, what did the Soviet Union do in the late 1980s? Soviet Union was far more capable military power than Russia today. And it did nothing, number one. Number two, maybe what Putin could do is ask his friend Kim Jong-un to supply Iran with some of those weapons that Russia needs. Because the reality is Russia's bogged down. Russia is incapable of strategic maneuvering. Other than threatening nuclear war over the health of its ally, Iran, there's nothing that Russia would be able to do. It has no way to project power as far as Iran. It has one aircraft carrier that struggles to round out, Gibraltar. Its Navy has no projection out here. And its Air Force is pretty busy. And quite frankly, its Air Force has been incapable of enforcing control over the airspace of Ukraine, which is next door. How would it project into Iran, given that it's much further? So I would say that there's nothing anyone would be able to do to help Iran if they were to cross this threshold. But we also have to understand that Iran is cognizant of this. So I don't want to overstate America's capabilities, because Iranians definitely are not underestimating them. Iran has acted relatively rationally over the last 12 months. Maybe that's a politically incorrect thing to say, but the reality is that all of their ballistic missile attacks targeted Israeli military sites. So this notion that Israel has the, sort of the legal right to attack beyond Iranian military sites is not necessarily true. Iran has focused its direct attack against Israel on its military sites. And this is probably what Americans are telling Israel, like, listen, you're going to have to focus on their military capabilities, attack their ballistic missile sites, attack their surface-to-air missiles, as you did in April. But economic infrastructure or nuclear is off limits. The other issue that I would say is that Iran has had an opportunity to put into place, once their president died in a helicopter tragedy, they could have put all sorts of hawks, hardliners in power, but they actually put a moderate. And that suggests to me that they were signaling to the United States of America that they're ready to negotiate on the nuclear program after the election is over, whoever wins. So that's another thing just to keep in mind. I think Iran is very much in agreement with me. They know that if they cross certain red lines, it's going to be a very binary response from the U.S., from 0 to 1 very quickly.
Worst case scenario, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but hypothetically, if we were to imagine a worst case scenario in which Israel would be forced to nuke Iran, what would that scenario be?
If Israel nukes Iran?
Yes.
Okay, wow, that's interesting.
What would need to happen to escalate to that point?
What a great question, David. This is well, I think Xerxes would have to come back from the dead. Raise, the movie 300, raise the Persian army and try to invade Israel through Iraq and Syria. I think it's highly unlikely. Look, one thing I will say is there's this talk about Iran getting a nuclear weapon and that being a moment that cannot happen, right? I mean, Donald Trump, you heard him say it. Joe Biden, I think, agrees. Obviously, Israelis agreed. And I understand completely. They see Iran as an enemy. But one thing I would say as a neutral observer, and my job is to be a nihilist analyst, so I don't care about, normative and moral issues are not part of my purview. What I would say is that if we calmly and rationally observed Iran's behavior over the last 40 years of the Islamic Republic, it has been a very rational actor. As I mentioned, in the late 80s, they attempted to close the Straits of Hormuz or make shipping a little bit more challenging. The United States absolutely pulverized them. They didn't react to that with some sort of irrational lashing out. They understood their constraints. And the other thing that I would remind a lot of viewers, is look into, just Google Israel-Iranian cooperation. So in the 1980s, Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran were actually kind of tacit allies. Why? Well, because their common enemy was actually Sunni-led Iraq. Sorry, obviously Iraq is majority Shia, but Saddam Hussein was the regional bad boy. And both Iran and Israel had a tacit alliance. I'm not going to say it was like full on, but they did cooperate through weapons and intelligence in order to deal with a common enemy. And so what that reveals is that Iran is not some sort of a, ideological theocracy. They're just not. They're just another geopolitical actor. The reason I say this is that if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, I do not see any scenario where they would actually use it in order to hasten the coming of the Mahdi or some other nonsense that people often say. They're going to act rationally, and they will probably, getting a nuclear weapon, I mean, it would lead to proliferation. Saudi Arabia will get a nuclear weapon almost certainly. But as it happened with Pakistan and India, I mean, my actual forecast would be that it would lead to a strategic balance in the region. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean we should hasten it. I completely understand why Israel and the United States don't want to hasten this moment, because what comes with strategic balance is also the ability of Iran to quite aggressively then pursue the strategy of supporting its proxies around the region. It'll be difficult then to have regime change, to punish them. There's all sorts of reasons why it's not a good thing if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, obviously. But I'm saying that if it did happen, the world would not end.
Okay, let's switch now to the U.S. election. I want to know how foreign policy first will be different under Harris versus Trump. Let's start with Harris first. She was asked on 60 Minutes who America's #1 adversary is. Take a listen.
Which foreign country do you consider to be our greatest adversary?
I think there's an obvious one in mind, which is Iran. Iran has American blood on their hands.
She goes on to explain why. But, I mean, is she right? I mean, the larger geopolitical arena, is Iran America's greatest threat right now?
Well, I think that, we can have a debate that lasts 30 minutes of this question. What I would say is that it's important that she said that, because it does tell us that there is this risk that between the election and the inauguration of the next president, there's a window in which the Biden administration, which will still be in charge, could very well give an ultimatum to Iran and say, listen, you got 3 months to dismantle this stuff because we're going to bomb you. I think that risk is very high. Again, as I would say, the most important chart that you can show is enriched uranium. Stockpile is double what it was the last time United States threatened conflict, not under Bush, not under Reagan, not under some hawk. The Obama administration threatened military action when Iran's stockpile was half of what it is today. So I think that this is a critical insight. David, I don't want to judge. I don't want to score. I don't want to give Kamala Harris a grade for that answer. I just want to say that as an analyst, I hear that and I say they're serious about confronting Iran over the next 3 to 4 months. And they would be serious even if Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah were not engaged in a conflict.
On the Trump side, he said repeatedly that if he were president, he would end the Ukraine war in a day. Take a listen to this short, for example.
I will prevent, and very easily, World War III, very easily. Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It will be settled quickly. I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order. And it will take me no longer than 1 day. I know exactly what to say to each of them. I got along very well with them.
Okay, how is he going to do that?
I think the way he would do that is he wouldn't have to do anything. The reality is the war is pretty much coming to its natural conclusion. Look, if you look at the map of the battleground between Russia and Ukraine, it hasn't really changed for 2 years. Both sides are exhausted. Gains are extremely limited. The incursion into Kursk was largely irrelevant. It actually drained Ukrainian capacity in Donetsk, allowing Russia to make advances. So it was a strategic error by Zelensky. I think that the reason he is correct is because Kiev would understand that their blank check has been revoked by the United States. And so they would have to sit down with Russia and have negotiations. Now, just to be clear, this is where people people say, well, what's the outcome of these negotiations, Marco? Like, does Kiev accept the annexation? No, of course not. Why would they? Wars have ended. Many wars have ended with uncertain outcomes. They become frozen conflicts. I mean, you have one of the most advanced economies on the planet right now, which is engaged in a frozen conflict. It's called South Korea. South Korea and North Korea never ended their war, ever. The war is still going on. They don't recognize each other. So that's one example. Another example from the region, more closer to Ukraine, of course, is Azerbaijan and Armenia. Armenia won the 1990s war. It gained control of Nagorno-Karabakh, which Azerbaijan never recognized. They said, okay, cool, we get it. You're controlling it for now. We do not accept your control. We will be back. And then in 2020, Azerbaijan did come back and reconquer that region. So you can have a ceasefire that lasts the next 20, 30 years. And so I think that would be the outcome of a Trump presidency. He's actually correct on that. On Iran, there's this assumption. I mean, you played it yourself, showing Biden saying no, Trump saying that's a crazy answer. On Iran, I actually would caution anyone who thinks that, Trump would be very pro-Israeli. I'm actually not sure about that. Trump is pro-American. And what that means is that, if the Israelis crossed Harris-Biden, they would be punished. If they crossed Trump, it would be extremely painful. And so I actually think that on the Iran question, Trump may be even harsher on Israel because he will want to deal with Iran on his own terms. And as we know from the convention speech he gave, he told us he was very close to concluding a deal with Iran. I believe him. And I believe that if Trump were to win, he will also call Tehran and be very clear about it. He will probably tell them something in unequivocal terms. You will get bombed within the next 48 hours unless you come back to the negotiating table. So I actually think that in both cases, the Trump administration will be much more dramatic, hyperbolic, but also will have the credibility from both American allies and enemies that, they will do and follow up with extreme kinetic action if they're not listened to.
Can we ultimately, in the next administration, doesn't matter who wins, see a pivot in the broader geopolitical strategy of America? For example, Obama saw the great American pivot to Asia, where the American military prioritized containing China more so than prior administrations. What's next for either Harris or Trump? Can we see a pivot?
Well, yes, I think that the Trump administration is actually in some way more aware that the world is multipolar. Whereas I think that the Harris or Biden administration is aware that it's a multipolar world, but they believe that strengthening American alliances is going to lead to more of a bipolar world, where they can create an alliance structure that elevates American power. And I think that the problem is that while Harris and Biden have done some pretty impressive things, so I'm not saying that they've done, they've been wrong, but in creating a coalition against China, they have struggled. Simply because China has not played a role of the villain that America has played it. Like if China was an actor playing in a Hollywood movie, trying to be a villain, it would have been fired by now. Like, you're just not scary enough. You're not evil enough. And that's a problem because American allies just simply do not want to fall in line when it comes to China for obvious reasons. It's an economic opportunity. There's a lot to be lost by becoming aligned with the US against China. You've even seen Australia try to improve its relations with China, and it was the tip of the spear. And so I think that the Biden administration and subsequently Harris administration will struggle to linearly extrapolate this confrontational attitude with China. The Trump administration, I mean, he told us at the convention, nobody listened to his speech, but he told us very clearly that he is actually open to negotiating with China. Again, he will do it in a hyperbolic, very aggressive manner that could lead to a lot of volatility in the near term. But his argument was, I will force them to build factories in the Midwest. And this is a serious, I think, insight into Trump's thinking. He understands the world is multipolar. And what he doesn't like about that is that a lot of American allies are actually getting FDI from China. Think about places like Vietnam, which is a tacit US ally, Mexico, Indonesia, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia. They're gobbling up all this FDI from China because China's trying to de-risk from itself. And instead of going around trying to do whack-a-mole, as the Harris-Biden administration have done, which is very difficult and impossible to be successful, Trump basically has simply pivoted and said, no, you're not going to send FDI to Mexico. You're going to send it to the United States of America. You're going to bring these factories to the US. You're going to do JVs with our firms. You're going to teach GM how to build EVs. And that's going to be that if you want access to the US market. In a way, that could create a new strategic balance between China and the US, because I think China will accept that challenge from Trump and say, okay, fine, we will do that.
Well, Trump just this week announced that he would threaten a 200% tariff on vehicles from Mexico. What is his end game with tariffs? Where's he going with all this?
The end game is what I just said. There has never been a year like 2024 in terms of outward FDI out of China. Never. I think what American policymakers under the Biden administration have completely missed is that China is more than willing to finance American national security priorities. Let me say that again. The greatest investor in American security is China. What do I mean? When America basically said, we're going to de-risk from you, China was like, no, we will de-risk from ourselves. Allow us. And so there's been $75 billion of outward FDI where China's going around the world building Chinese, owned factories so that they can continue to export to the United States. And so Trump's threat of 200% tariffs on Mexico is really a attempt to get some of that FDI pie. What Trump is basically saying is like, look, don't build a BYD factory in Mexico, build it in Ohio. And then I'm going to do to you what you did to us in the early 2000s when you forced all of our corporations to do JVs with you. You're going to have to do a JV with GM. You're going to have to do a JV with Ford. And you're going to have to give up your IP and your technology on EVs to the United States of America and our companies. If you want access to our domestic market, you're going to have to play by our rules. And what's interesting about this, David, is that basically we've gone full circle. In the 1990s and the 2000s, it was the Chinese domestic market, 1.5 billion people. Oh my God. Well, we all, of course, know how that ended. The real estate crisis and secular stagnation has caused Chinese consumers to basically stop consuming, more or less. Whereas American consumers have been propped up by fiscal stimulus. So they're out there YOLOing. And so who has more of a sort of, economic power from a perspective of domestic market? Obviously, Chinese companies, Chinese corporates are desperate to continue selling to the Americans. That gives U.S. leverage. And President Trump understands this, which is why he has pivoted towards this, pretty nuanced way to deal with China. Now, I think that Biden and Harris administration might be, tempted to do the same. The problem is American politics. American politics are fickle and unfair. And what I mean by that is, of course, we all know the old adage, only Nixon could go to China. What that means is that only a hawk, someone who's extremely aggressive, can negotiate with an enemy. And I think that unfortunately for Biden and Harris, if they proposed to invite Chinese factories into the Midwest, they would be laughed out of the room. That's the unfair part of American politics. I don't think that the American public or Congress or Republicans in Congress would accept something like that. Whereas with Trump, because he's seen as so virulently anti-Chinese, he can pretty much make any deal he wants. And the US political context will allow him to do that. He will, put it this way, he took off in the anti-China plane. Biden and Harris have been flying in the plane and they don't know how to land it. Only Trump can land the US-China trade plane down. Only he can land it. And I think he will.
Last points I want to make. Investment implications for either a Harris or Trump win. Take a look at my chart here. I'm showing you the CPI chart because the argument for inflation or reflation under Trump is that tariffs are inflationary. Now, if you look at how the CPI has actually performed over the Trump presidency between 2017 and 2021, barring the deflation we had during COVID, inflation has been relatively stable. Is it true to make the argument that tariffs are not indeed inflationary?
I think we over-index, David, on inflation.
Okay.
Sorry, we over-index on tariffs. Okay. As I just said, it's hard for me to even tell you what Trump's policy will be. I actually don't think he will put tariffs, or he might put them in the short term, but he will use them as tools for negotiations.
Yeah.
So I think a much more important role here is fiscal policy. Basically, we've got, 6-7% US GDP deficit, largest in a non-recession outside of wartime. And you've got two candidates where there is really no difference between them. Like Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, investors should see them as the same person. There is no difference.
Well, just on that note, Harris wants to raise capital gains taxes. I've heard from some economists and analysts that this could be bearish for stocks. If she wins, stocks sell off. Nobody likes higher taxes. Is that true?
So I think it would be bearish for stocks if she had control of Congress. But what I would say is that her revenue-raising policies are insufficient. His revenue-raising policies are insufficient. Both of them, in net terms, would add to the fiscal deficit. There was only one candidate of fiscal responsibility, and her name was Nikki Haley. And she got 20 delegates out of 2,500. So clearly, the voters don't want austerity. They don't want fiscal responsibility. They chose two candidates. Although, you could argue they didn't choose Kamala Harris, but whatever. The point is the two parties are not interested in fiscal responsibility. So what I tell my clients is, forget who wins. What matters is how they win. What matters is, will they have the ability to pursue their policies? Given the Senate math in 2024, you don't have to focus on Kamala Harris's policies at all, because if she wins, she will not carry the Senate. And so it doesn't matter, David, if she wants to raise capital gains taxes. It's irrelevant. She won't get to do any of that, which is why her victory would not be that upsetting to the market, either the bond or the equity market. It will be kind of a meh outcome. You have a Democratic president. You'll have Republicans controlling the Senate almost certainly. And so you can just go on doing your business of being an investor by ignoring the US government. However, the reason that Trump is a catalyst, the reason that he has agency, and the reason that investors have to prepare for him as an outcome is that he will carry the Senate and the House if he wins, almost 90% certainty in that case, if he wins the White House. And in that case, I think the biggest risk to the equity market is that we will have to price in his fiscal plans, which are basically to add somewhere between $3 and $6 trillion worth of debt. I'm not sure that the bond market is going to, digest that very easily. So the biggest risk then becomes a bond market sell-off, which we saw at the end of 2023 when the 10-year yield went from 3.75 to 5%. It did cause agita to the equity market. And so I'm actually very cautious this time around if Trump wins. In 2016, I was one of the few people who said that, look, if Trump wins, it's good for stocks. Don't worry about it. Everything will be fine. Provided World War III doesn't start. It didn't. He put a bunch of Goldman Sachs executives on the White House cabinet. Everything was fine. So stocks went up. But bonds did sell off in 2016. It's just that nobody cared because at the time, the economy needed someone like Trump. It needed growth. Heck, it needed inflation, David. In 2016, we needed some inflation too. An inflationary economic populace was good for stocks. This time around, I'm not sure we need either growth and inflation. In fact, the reason your viewers might be bullish is because of the soft landing narrative. What does soft landing mean? Lower inflation, lower growth.
Is that your base case? Last question. Soft landing?
So my base case right now is no landing, and I'll tell you why. This summer I was concerned. I think recession probability had gone up, but policymakers in both Washington, D.C. and Beijing are clearly moving towards a reflation. It reminds me of late 2015, early 2016. You don't want to, there's that old adage, you don't want to fight the Fed. Well, I would add to that, you don't want to fight the Fed and the Chinese Communist Party at the same time. And so the way to think about it is that this is a risk. No landing is a risk. Why? Because if Donald Trump wins and he implements basically stimulative policies on an economy that's perfectly fine and in fact has tailwinds from policymakers, I don't think you need any more fiscal support. And that's where the risk becomes too much growth, too much inflation in 2025. Bond market can see ahead and it can, the 10-year yield could be above 5% pretty quickly after a Trump election. Very good. Thank you very much, Marko. You are the chief strategist of GeoMacro Strategy, a new service. Tell us where we can find your work at BCA and tell us what viewers can expect to learn from your service. So first of all, they can go to the website, bcaresearch.com, and take a look at it. But what I'm doing is basically it's a discretionary macro investment strategy where my methodological bias is geopolitics and politics. So I write a macro strategy. I don't write a geopolitical strategy. This isn't about what's going to happen to Iran and Israel. I'm focused purely on the big asset classes, on the macro context. But I do so by basically seeing politics and geopolitics everywhere. So it's unique in that way, in that, obviously I use macroeconomics, I use the market, I use technical data too. I mean, it's BCA Research 76-year history, but I blend that with geopolitics and politics to make market calls. I always joke, reading a note from me, it's kind of like watching The Sixth Sense, that movie with Bruce Willis where the little kid sees dead people everywhere. I see dead people everywhere. Well, I see politics and geopolitics everywhere, and that's how I try to find alpha opportunities and also long-term strategic asset allocation opportunities where politics and geopolitics are a catalyst.
I also encourage people to check out your book, Geopolitical Alpha, in which you've outlined the philosophy of using politics and geopolitics to make investment recommendations. So thank you very much for joining our program today. I'll put the link to BCA Research and to your book in the description below. So make sure to check out Marko there. Thank you, Marko. Speak again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.